So, hey friends, this is me, Vishwas, and I'm the host of this podcast. A lot of times when you start your journey with Kubernetes, there is a lot that goes behind. It's not just knowing what containers are. It's not just getting to know what kubectl commands is. It's also about knowing what is the fundamental element of knowledge that is required for me to solve the problem statement. It can be anything as minute as what goes between the parts and what communicates within a part, or else anything that is related to the security. It's still vast. Kubernetes is vast to a large extent, and of course, Devtron is trying to solve a lot of problems. And in the Kubernetes 101 series, we have this podcast where we are going to call out professionals from different use cases or else different field of engineering, and we are going to interview and collect some insights about how to start your journey with Kubernetes. Today I'm with Hali Kahoot, and over to you. Let's start with a short introduction and we can go on with the podcast.
Sure. Hi, everyone. And hi, Vishwas. My name is Mohammad Ali Kahoot. So, I am currently working as a senior SRE at PowerPay. So, basically, we are a fintech, basically operating in Africa region from the Europe region. So, I'm working as a senior SRE. I have almost 8 years of experience in the SRE and development experience. So, I started out as a developer. I completed my bachelor's in computer science. I had 2 years of experience in software development, and then I moved towards the DevOps field, the specialized DevOps field, and working over there. So I have almost 6 years of experience in Kubernetes. So I started in 2017, basically exploring the Kubernetes world. I am currently working as a part-time trainer of DevOps as well. So I have trained more than 600 professionals on Kubernetes and DevOps, including corporate boot camps and different weekly sessions as well. So yeah, I have enough experience in Kubernetes and all the other DevOps related tools as well. So yeah, I believe that's it from my side related to Kubernetes and those things.
Got it. So now let's start with where does the journey of learning Kubernetes start? Because a lot of times people are saying, you know what, I want to enter DevOps and Kubernetes is a must. But I always say that, you know what, DevOps doesn't start with Kubernetes. DevOps existed even before Kubernetes existed. So where does the journey of learning Kubernetes start? Because this is a requirement of the industry.
Yeah, exactly. I would totally second you that Kubernetes is not just the tool for DevOps, and you cannot say that we have implemented Kubernetes in our company, so we are a DevOps company and we have implemented DevOps completely, because Kubernetes is just a part of that puzzle. The whole puzzle is actually to accelerate the software delivery lifecycle and accelerate or help the developers basically push out their features to production faster. So Kubernetes is just one part of that puzzle, but actually it's quite a big part of that puzzle as well. So coming to your question, that how can one move to Kubernetes and what are the essential tools to learn before learning Kubernetes? So first of all, the main thing would be containers. I would say that is the main block, because Kubernetes also is built upon that block. So if you learn containers, then only you can understand Kubernetes and other parts of Kubernetes, because that's the first block. If you don't know the first block and you have created the whole building, the building will collapse because you don't know the basics of it. So the containers are the first part of it. You should start learning from that. You should start learning how a container works. Actually, you should start why was a container built, how was a container built, what are the main principles behind a container, and what's the difference between a container, a VM, a process, all of those things. So you would be much better able to understand how the Kubernetes world works when you will understand how containers actually work. So that would be the main block. I would say learn containers, learn how Docker actually runs containers, how you can build an image, how you can build a better image. I myself, as I said, I train people. So I know people, they don't even know that, okay, their application is running on, let's say, port 8080, and they have exposed port 9090 in Kubernetes service, and they say that, okay, why is this communication isn't working? Because they themselves then don't know that first is application. Your application would be packaged in a Docker image, which will run as a Docker container, as a container, and then you will expose it through Kubernetes. So that's the most outer block. you first need to understand the inner blocks or the base blocks of your application and the container. So that would be the first part. If someone wants to move towards DevOps and wants to learn Kubernetes and wants to learn move towards the DevOps specialized field, I would first of all make basically recommend you learning containers as the first part of it.
Sure. I think there is a lot of buzz that's going on behind why Kubernetes, right? There is obviously that first question that is asked is, are we up for the scale, or else are we ready for the scales? Are we Kubernetes ready? Or else can we start adopting Kubernetes in the first and then go on exploring what is inside Kubernetes? So there's a lot of puzzle that goes behind when people try to adapt Kubernetes, and that's the fun part about Kubernetes, right? I always say this, before Kubernetes, nobody talked how much is the RAM usage, how much is the CPU usage, how much was the memory getting overused or anything like that. But it was just VM procurement, done, tick mark, and we are ready for scale. But today, the definition has scale. We scale based on these utilization. So when and how and what are the matrices that an organization or an engineering team need to consider when they are adopting Kubernetes?
Yeah, so that's a very, very, very valid question, I would say, in terms of companies adopting towards Kubernetes or companies moving towards Kubernetes, because I myself have seen companies having 2 to 3 microservices only, the front end, just these 2 microservices, and they are saying to me that we want to move to Kubernetes. So to me, that's just a overhead. Basically, you are killing a fly with a shotgun. That's not the purpose of Kubernetes. For that, there are other things as well. So again, I will say, first try to understand containers. So if you have containerized your application, if you run it in a plain Docker environment, you would know that, okay, how much memory it is taking, how, if you have a staging environment, for example, or if you have a local on demand or a developer's machine experience, so you can create a Docker compose file, run it on Docker containers locally, and then maybe basically ask yourself that, is it equivalent to running a high or a very big basically a lot of number of microservices applications. So for example, there are other container orchestrators as well. So many people don't know that. Many people just basically, when they start learning DevOps, they learn the first question, okay, Kubernetes, so they move towards that. So Kubernetes is just a container orchestrator. Or by orchestrator, what it means is, so if you have seen an orchestra, so there is a person basically who is handling all the nodes or all the people. So Kubernetes is that manager that is handling all the containers and all the nodes, where a container should run and how it should run. So there are other container orchestrators as well. For example, every cloud provides it, AWS ECS, AWS Azure container instance. So you can use that if you have a smaller number of microservices. But if you have quite big microservices, for example, you have 50, 15, 30, 100 of microservices, then I would definitely recommend going towards Kubernetes, because then you can manage them yourself. The biggest benefit of Kubernetes is that you know what's running in your cluster and how it's running and how you can scale it up or how you can do it. As you mentioned that previously people never worried about these things because they had an auto scaling group. They just run their applications in a single instance. So one instance was running one replica. When they had scaled, they scaled up the auto scaling group. They never cared about, okay, what's the memory usage, what's those usages, and because there was a lot of resource wastage, I would say, at that point. But with Kubernetes, now you actually plan up your deployments. You know that, okay, you have a 4 node cluster, 10 node cluster, 100 node cluster, and you have hundreds of microservices. So how would you scale them, or how would you actually run them? So that is the question. Again, should you adopt Kubernetes or not? That depends on your use case. If you have a lot of microservices that have total communication, if you want control for yourself, then go towards Kubernetes. Because the disadvantages of Kubernetes over other container orchestrators are that you would have to manage each and everything yourself. You would have to deploy monitoring, you would have to deploy logging, you would have to deploy any GitOps tool, you would have to deploy the CI/CD part of it, or the plan, all of it yourself. No one else would do that if you are not using a managed company or managed platform. If I'm just using an AWS EKS cluster, I would have to deploy all of these things myself. I would have to upgrade the Kubernetes cluster version. I would have to upgrade the kubelet version. So all of these things, the control is with me as a DevOps engineer or as an SRE engineer. I would have the control. And if you want that control for your applications, Kubernetes is the answer. But if you want least overhead, as companies normally the short or basically small sized startup, they don't want control themselves, they want the cloud to handle that. Then Lambda, ECS, or other things, that are the better options. The serverless model, basically moving towards those rather than moving towards a managed Kubernetes offering. So that would be the main question you need to answer yourself, because there is lack of knowledge. Even myself, I have seen companies moving towards Kubernetes with very limited knowledge. A developer just read a blog and he thought that, okay, let's deploy on Kubernetes, or a manager just read that Kubernetes is the answer of all questions. So he said that, okay, let's move to Kubernetes. But after 6 months, they had to hire a person with specialized knowledge of those things to basically fix all the problems they were having. They had no ingress, they had no such capabilities, they were using node ports in their ingresses. So that's all the problems that come with Kubernetes. It's a lot of knowledge curve as well in Kubernetes that a developer or your system administrator, the previous system administrator, would need to learn when you deploy to Kubernetes.
Sure, we talked about organization thinking process. We also talked about a lot about how things have to be managed in Kubernetes. But now the difficult part is, what are the most critical components in an Kubernetes environment, or else a Kubernetes cluster, or else anything that is related to Kubernetes? Because fundamental understanding is pods are the basic unit of the Kubernetes. That's absolutely fine. Nodes run everything straight up and everything is isolated, and this APIs getting tracked, this and that. But what is the most critical component in an Kubernetes environment, or else a cluster? You can just go through any of the jargon about it.
Sure. So yeah, again, as you mentioned, that people don't know. I have, even you mentioned pods. Many people don't understand pods as well. They just understand deployments, because every blog just starts from a Kubernetes deployment. They don't tell you what an actual pod is, what a controller is, what a replica set is, what a deployment is. They just start from, okay, create this YAML file, just replace your image with this image, and then just deploy it, and okay, your application is now running. So that's it, you are also happy that my application is running. But if you don't know the basics of all of this thing, then again you are going towards a failure in the future. I can guarantee you that, because Kubernetes is complex in itself. You must understand the basics. So as you said, the major component of the most important component of Kubernetes, in my opinion, would be etcd. That is the brain of your Kubernetes cluster, or that is where all the data, where all the state is in your cluster. If I somehow delete your etcd, your Kubernetes cluster would not know anything. Everything would be deleted, everything would go down. So understanding all the core components, so the major components, also the division between master nodes, worker nodes. So there are control plane nodes, which were previously called the master nodes, and then there are the worker nodes as well. You need to understand the difference between both of them. Master node has different components, worker node has some sort of different functionality to run. So master node has etcd, API server, a controller manager, schedulers, which actually helps to run your application. So etcd, in my opinion, the most important. Controller manager, another important component that will actually run the replicas that you tell it, or basically it will match the current state with the desired state of your cluster. Scheduler, that will actually tell the API server to schedule the pods on node 1 or node 2 or node 3, 4, whichever nodes there are. And API server, obviously the communication hub. So every communication goes through the API server. It's the main communicating hub of your Kubernetes cluster. If that goes down, you would not be able to communicate with your Kubernetes cluster. You would not be able to update. You would not be able to get what's running in your cluster. So all of these major 4 or 5 components are the main components that a Kubernetes master node actually runs. Obviously not going into very much details, but these 4 components, if someone wants to again go into details, he can read it, or basically search for these things. And then comes the kubelet. Kubelet is the master, or you can say the lead of the every node. There is a kubelet running on every node of your cluster, and that's the actual leader of that node that is reporting the status of the node to API server and telling the Kubernetes that, okay, this node is healthy, this node is able to take more input from you. So all of these things you need to understand before moving towards or just deploying a deployment or just installing kubectl and just communicating with the cluster. You need to understand how these components work, because in my experience, what I have seen, the kubelet was down, the kubelet had some issues, and companies didn't know, the developers didn't know, they just deleted the whole cluster and recreated the cluster because they didn't know what to do. They knew that, okay, application would run when we install when we run the deployment, they will just deleted the cluster, they recreated the cluster, created worker nodes, and then applied all the deployments again. So that, in my opinion, is quite a wastage of what you are doing, and just because you don't know it, how the things actually work.
Sure. I think the biggest puzzle while debugging anything on Kubernetes has always been there are some stateful, stateless, static application which you want to draw from a previous EC2 instance, and now you are or else an ECS instance which is so costly that you really want to draw all the microservices out of it, and now you want to put it onto the Kubernetes. And even if you are successful, it's not the end of the road, because there's a lot of things that can go down if you are misconfigured, not just in the beginning, even if you can misconfigure the future adaptable microservices as well. So what are the things that is required when we or you, like as an engineer, start debugging anything on Kubernetes, and what is a fundamental understanding that is required when we are debugging something on Kubernetes?
Sure. So yeah, again, as I mentioned, the best thing about Kubernetes is it's just blocks. So different blocks have combined together to make a whole cluster. So you need to understand those blocks. So as you said that when there is an issue in your application, for example, how would you debug it? The first question you need to ask is my application fine? Is my code fine? Have I tested my code locally? It works fine. If not, if yes, then, and also you can basically port forward to your pod exactly and find out that, okay, whether my application is the issue or it's something else. Because you need to understand, again, Kubernetes will run your application. It will not do anything else on top of it. The application you wrote will be running in a Kubernetes pod or in a container at the end. So if your application is fine, that you need to debug by actually port forwarding to the pod, or you actually running the application locally and seeing that whether this endpoint works fine or not, or whatever the issue. Then comes the controllers replica set, whether the pod is fine or not, whether the replica set's configuration is fine or not, whether the deployment's configuration is fine or not, whether have I missed or have I mistyped the Docker image or the image tag. Basically, many times this also happens, that you have mistyped the image tag, and the Kubernetes is complaining that I cannot find the image, or the image cannot be found, the manifest not found, that sort of an error, and you just keep complaining that, okay, Kubernetes is not working. That's nothing to do with Kubernetes. That's your typo that you did. So these things then go towards different networking service. Have you given the correct labels on the pod or not? Are you selecting the correct pod based on that label from the service or not? That is the third point. Again, you can do kubectl port forward to the service and find out that whether I'm running the same pod or not. You can check the endpoints. I know many of the people won't even know what endpoints is, Kubernetes endpoints. So you can check whether there are successful endpoints or not in Kubernetes. The service is able to select pods or not, and has created endpoints or not. So you can basically see those things. If that is successful, then the fourth thing would be the ports, whether the port configuration is fine. So if your application runs on 8080, so your service also needs to point to the target port should be 8080 rather than anything else. So that you need to understand. And if all of this is correct, and even then your container is, or the pod is not able to run, then you need to basically understand whether my kubelet is fine or not. The kubelet, where the node where your containers will run, whether that's fine or not. If that is also fine, then API server, whether that's fine or not. Then controller manager, whether that's fine or not, whether it's able to run containers or run controllers or not. So again, all are building blocks or all the blocks of a building. So if one block will stop working, you cannot just demolish the whole building and recreate the building. You need to understand which block isn't working, and let's just fix that block. I have seen many times it happens that a kubelet isn't working, you just restarted the kubelet, it starts working again. Obviously you need to find or debug the better solution for it, but restarting a kubelet works fine because there was an issue in kubelet. At that time, if I keep deleting the pod, if I keep recreating the pod, it will not help because I am actually not finding the root cause of the problem. So all of, even probes, so you need to understand what probes are. Your application is not running fine, the probes are failing, the containers are restarting, Kubernetes is saying that your basically probes are failing. So you need to check that rather than just again deleting the pod again and again and again, and it will not help because the probes are not working. And the best solution for all of this is the kubectl describe command. If you are able to run or know the kubectl commands, then there is a very beneficial command, kubectl describe, that you can run on your pod and see whether there is any issue in your pod or not, or in any resource, or if there is any issue, then you can debug that and then maybe go forward with that. Many people don't even know how to describe a resource, and then they just keep on jumping on conclusions themselves rather than getting the facts out of Kubernetes. Kubernetes speaks itself that what is the main root cause of your issue.
Sure. I think we have talked a lot. So, ending note. So, how can a guy without a knowledge of Kubernetes or else anything start learning Kubernetes? So, this is one of the segments where people lack the information, and it's not just going through somebody's blog or else going through the documentation, which is too vast. It's always a tough choice to go through. So, where are some of those golden resources that you feel like, this is a place where you have to go and start looking for if you want to really learn Kubernetes the right way? So, are there any resources that you have found? And also, some of the exams or else the certifications that you recommend for any of the people who are starting, like any of them who are starting right now in terms of Kubernetes, where can they start in their certification journey?
Sure. Okay, so how to learn Kubernetes and how to learn containers? So obviously there are a lot of resources on YouTube, free resources. There are free courses that you can learn from. Obviously I can't name anyone at this moment, but or not I can recommend any paid courses or paid platforms. Even I myself, as I said, that I teach DevOps and those things, but I wouldn't say to come towards me and learn from myself, because there are a lot of free resources that you can go and just practice along with them. So that is again the containers, Kubernetes, that is a must thing. You must start from containers. Don't jump into Kubernetes bandwagon before starting containers. My first recommendation would be that. Now coming to your certifications part, personally, I will recommend the CKAD. There is a certification, Certified Kubernetes Application Developer, for everyone who wants to move towards the Kubernetes field. There is another one as well, the Certified Kubernetes Administrator and Certified Kubernetes Security Specialist. So I myself am CKA and CKAD, but the CKAD one, why I prefer over CKA, because in that you will actually be able to communicate with Kubernetes as a developer, how a developer would be able to run his applications on Kubernetes. All of those things you would be able to cover in that. So that covers deployments, running an application on Kubernetes, the service part, the ingress part, config maps, secrets, all of those things are covered in that certification. And I will highly recommend doing that if you are thinking to move towards Kubernetes. The CKA, the Certified Kubernetes Administrator, that majorly focuses on the Kubernetes components that I mentioned, the etcd, the scheduler, and those things, which nowadays, as we speak, most people now focus on managed Kubernetes, managed EKS, managed AKS, managed GKE. So those roles are a bit, I would say, not used that much, because now the cloud is managing those services. You might just need to communicate with the kubelet as it, but not other resources as such, because now they are being managed by the cloud itself. So personally, I will recommend the CKAD one, which is the most beneficial if you are thinking of moving towards this. And obviously then the CKA, then the CKS, the security one. So these are the three major certifications for Kubernetes that you can do. And then obviously GitOps as well, other certifications. But and there are a lot of courses online, a lot of blogs online. I myself have one or two blogs related to Kubernetes. So basically understanding the differences. I myself, when I started learning Kubernetes, so the major question I always asked was why the databases use stateful sets and why the normal applications use deployments. So I didn't have an answer. I was just deploying applications, but I didn't have an answer at that time. And when I tried to learn through it, there was no resources at that time. And then I wrote a blog on it. I learned about it and I wrote a blog on it. And today that blog is quite successful. It has received a lot of appreciation. And again, I will say to all of you as well, learn things and then write about it, because at this moment even there are many things that are undiscovered or that have not been written about, or the videos are not there for you to learn. So you can do that yourself, write about your experiences of how you are learning and what you are learning, and those things.
Sure. I think this is just the tip of an iceberg. This is just the tip of an iceberg that we have touched. We have a lot of sessions planned in the Kubernetes one-on-one series, as well as we have a lot of sessions that is getting planned from a lot of professionals from different fields, from healthcare, fintech, gaming, as well as a lot of other industries that we are targeting. The segment is huge. The target segment of Kubernetes is huge because nobody wants to lose a customer and nobody wants to just take a challenge on how they scale. So now Kubernetes is the most hot topic, and we are here to educate you folks, bring in professionals like Ali who can share their insights, share their knowledge with you in order to educate you the right way. And thank you so much, Ali, for being on the show. It means a lot.
Thank you, Vishwas, for having me, and obviously love your output and love how you are basically going to build a Kubernetes 101 series to educate people, because that's what actually we need at the moment. We need to educate people, because as we are moving towards the Kubernetes realm, all the industry is moving. We need to actually know what Kubernetes is just before moving. So that's the main part, and obviously you are playing that role in that part as well. So obviously, best of luck to you in that.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ali. Meet you soon with another series. Meet you soon with another guest who is going to share you a lot of insight. Thank you so much, folks, and thank you so much, Ali.